After the Reform Act, Robert Peel set about building a conservative political party in the modern sense, whose members would work together on commonly agreed policies, would provide united opposition to the Whigs when in the minority, and united support to their leader, the Prime Minister, when in the majority, while learning to submit to the discipline of parliamentary whips. Peel was an excellent parliamentarian and manager who presided over a great conservative revival. He was, however, distinct from most of his followers. Most conservatives in the 1830s and 40s were country gentlemen, whose income came from rent and from the sale of crops. Peel himself, by contrast, was the son of a wealthy manufacturer, who had bought his way into the upper classes. Aware of the landed classes' obsessions, Peel was also aware of the need to conciliate and to legislate in the interest of the industrialists and manufacturers whose enterprises were changing the face of Britain. He became Prime Minister in 1841 after a great electoral triumph, and led the nation during the tense years of what were known at the time as the Hungry Forties. Fear of social revolution from below, anxiety about the industrialists, and recurrent Irish crises prompted Peel to make concessions to his adversaries, from fear that they would otherwise provoke unrest. But these concessions, culminating with the Maynooth Grant and the repeal of the Corn Laws, led many Conservatives to regard their own leader as a betrayer. The Conservative Party split irrevocably in 1846, with one group following Peel, another group following Disraeli, the decade's rising star, and a third group following William Gladstone to join the Whigs in the making of the Liberal Party. Not for more than 2 decades after 1846 would this rift in the Conservatives be healed. Well, Robert Peel's early career demonstrated his exceptional abilities. His father's success in business enabled the young Robert Peel to grow up like an aristocrat. His father was a cotton manufacturer and a millionaire from Lancashire who became an hereditary baronet in 1800. Robert himself rose rapidly through the ranks of the Tories in the 1810s and 1820s, a very, very gifted parliamentarian, and he was already the Conservative leader in the Commons under the Duke of Wellington at the time of the Catholic Emancipation Crisis and the Reform Act, which we looked at in the previous lecture. He was very hard-working, a real political professional, when aristocratic amateurs were still common in high places. He attracted dedicated supporters, including Gladstone, who said that Peel was the greatest man he'd ever met. But as I mentioned last time, his guidance of Catholic emancipation through the Commons in 1829 sowed the seeds of suspicion in the minds of the Conservative ultras. After the Great Reform Act of 1832, he set about organising the Conservative Party in something resembling its modern form. He saw the possibility of attracting moderate Whigs who, after the Reform Act, were concerned to preserve political stability. One point I need to emphasise here is this, that although sometimes Conservative propaganda alleged that the Whigs were radicals, it was nearly always misleading. The political nation, still relatively narrow, had common shared beliefs in the importance of political stability. That is, in addition to the Conservative Party itself, there's a kind of overarching conservatism on all sides in British politics, which of course makes it much easier for the nation to retain its durability and stability. Now, in the Tamworth Manifesto of 1834, Peel declared that he regarded the Reform Act as done with and fully accepted. In other words, it was in part a warning to the Conservatives, don't be hankering for the old pre-reform days. They've gone forever. We've got to move on now. We've got to adapt ourselves to new political realities. In a speech from 1838, Peel spoke about the Conservatives being a party, that is, admitting that they were a party, which until then had been something that most factions tried to deny, but at the same time to mix this new idea of being a party with old ideas which sound vivid echoes of Edmund Burke. Here's what Peel said. "My object for some years past has been to lay the foundation of a great party. I was deeply impressed with the conviction of the necessity of forming such a party from the period when a great change was made in the representative system of the country. In other words, the Reform Act, which by then was 6 years old. I am confident that those who were the most convinced of the abstract merits of that change, who saw its absolute necessity in the progress of events and the change of public opinion, would now admit that, although unnecessary, still it was a fearful experiment, that there was a danger that the great shock given to prescriptive authority might lead to too hasty prescriptive and irrational future changes, that those who were strongest in good intentions might, in their too sanguine hopes of reaching a species of perfection which could not be attained, forego that degree of perfection which was attainable. That's a wonderful conservative statement. In other words, we've got to be careful. It's all right for us to reach for improvements, but let's not reach too far, because unfortunately in doing that, we might destroy even the good things that we have managed to achieve. And Peel had some success in the late 1830s and early 1840s in bringing over to the Conservative side moderate, pro-reform members of Parliament who now sought stability and continuity rather than continued further reforms. As I mentioned last time, one of the great things about the Great Reform Act was that it demonstrated Parliament's ability to reform itself. But of course that did give rise to the anxiety in the minds of many people, the anxiety that perpetual reform might now begin and unravel the securities. Peel's core constituencies were the Church of England, the Tory squires, the lawyers and the old wealth merchants in the City of London. Peel was able to insinuate in the late 1830s that Lord Melbourne's Whig government was actually encouraging lawlessness. And sometimes Peel's rhetoric became a little bit panicky. In 1840 he said that this country is now convulsed with political disorder, that a spirit of insubordination is spreading far and wide. Nay, that rebellion and insurrection are rearing their heads. Instead of being a control over evil passions and a check upon unruly acts, you make the government and the magistracy the actual fomenters of disaffection and subordination. Well, that was a deeply misleading remark, especially as addressed to Lord Melbourne, who was the Whig Prime Minister, a member of the aristocracy, and a close friend of the young Queen, Queen Victoria, who'd come to the throne in 1837. It was as unrealistic as the Federalists' assertion that Jefferson was a Jacobin back in the election of 1800. Twice, Peel became so convinced that Britain was on the brink of an insurrection that he fortified his own manor house, Drayton Manor. He was afraid that the industrial workers from the nearby cities would gather and create an ad hoc army and march against Drayton, something which never in fact happened. But of course, it's easy to be calm after the fact. Who knows from day to day when an uprising might break out? If we think about ourselves in the days immediately after September the 11th, 2001, you can perhaps recall that there was an intense fear that there might be more and more terrorist attacks day after day. Now we know that there weren't more, but that doesn't mean that it was an unreasonable thing to be afraid of at the time. And it isn't as though Peel was entirely secured against violence. His private secretary was assassinated in 1843 by a man who meant to kill Peel himself. And of course, that kind of brush with an assassin is itself a galvanising and a life-changing event. Well, Peel won a general election in 1841. The Conservative Party came back to power with a clear majority in Parliament. He ruled capably, but he increased some members of his party's suspicions by making concessions on issues which to them seemed non-negotiable. He's always been a controversial figure among historians, just as he was a controversial figure among his contemporaries. One view of Peel is this, that the best kind of conservative is the man who always makes judicious concessions to forestall revolution. Another view is, on some issues you can't compromise or yield without becoming treacherous to your own constituency. Both views were often expressed in his own day, and both of those views have often been expressed since. So he's a lively figure around whom reasonable people can disagree. The historian Frank O'Gorman says this: Peelite conservatism emphasised and sought to preserve many of the traditional elements of the old Toryism. It was the gospel of strong and sound government, of law and order, of the defence of property and the preservation of the Constitution. At the same time, he commended the institutions of the country to the nation. He revered the monarchy, the church, and the old balanced constitution. But he believed that the reform of diseased limbs might in the long run enable the body politic to survive. If anything, Peel perhaps failed to recognise the importance of the Tory squires' support, and sometimes he failed to conceal the fact that he was disdainful of their outlook. Here's the historian Bruce Coleman talking about Peel. He believed that he was serving the interests of the gentry by protecting them in a dangerous and changing world, but he had little respect for their intelligence, opinions, or policy preferences. Formidably wealthy, formidably intelligent, formidably experienced in office, he felt something like contempt for the backwoodsmen on the benches behind him, men of great principle and pretension whom he saw as ignorant, bigoted, narrowly self-interested, and blind both to the dictates of office and to their own long-term security. In other words, he'd accepted John Stuart Mill's old remark that the Conservatives really are the stupid party and that it was his particular burden to be their leader. This is a common characteristic of very gifted leaders in the politics all over the world, from all parties, to despise some of their own important followers. Now, another mistake that Peel made, although it wasn't clear at the time, it became clear later on, was that when he became Prime Minister in 1841, he failed to give an executive office, to a very ambitious young Conservative Member of Parliament, Benjamin Disraeli, whose exclusion from the cabinet was a source of lasting bitterness that turned Disraeli, later to be a great Conservative leader himself in the next generation, into a bitter and irreconcilable enemy. After the fact, Peel must have thought, if only I'd been a little bit more conciliatory with Disraeli. Disraeli was already a popular novelist, that's how he came to fame, and he scoffed that Peel was yielding far too much to the Whig programme. He said, what we've got under Peel is Tory men and Whig measures. In his novel Coningsby, published in 1844, Disraeli satirises the position which Peel held, and Disraeli wrote, "There was indeed considerable shouting about what they called conservative principles. But the awkward question naturally arose, what will you conserve? The prerogatives of the Crown, provided they are not exercised. The independence of the House of Lords, provided it is not asserted. The ecclesiastical estate, provided it is regulated by a commission of laymen. Everything, in short, that is established, as long as it is a phrase and not a fact." Well, in that little passage, you can see Disraeli undermining Peel by saying Peel doesn't really have the courage of his own convictions. He's really posing a Conservative Prime Minister rather than actually being one. One of the things that Peel did, which again was perhaps necessary but was almost certain to make him a little bit more unpopular, was his introduction or his reintroduction of the income tax. It certainly made economic sense, but it was politically unpopular. During the Napoleonic Wars there had been an income tax, but it had been abolished in 1815 when the wars ended after the Battle of Waterloo and the government's revenue demands decreased. But from 1842 right up to the present, the income tax has been in effect in Britain, and it's a vital source of government revenue. But of course, it was resented at the time as a new imposition, and it's been resented at some level ever since. One point in which Peel did win widespread support from his own party was in his resistance to the Chartist movement. And the Chartist movement was perhaps the most important political agitation of the 1830s and 40s. There were many people in Britain, particularly working class people and members of the lower middle class, who had a bitter feeling of regret and resentment about what had happened in the Great Reform Act, who said it didn't go nearly far enough. It certainly didn't give to most people, most ordinary men of Britain, any kind of political representation. And the Chartists, who assembled a document called the People's Charter, had a list of demands which they wanted to be the basis of subsequent reforms of Parliament. And they, on several occasions, they presented massive petitions to Parliament pleading for a new round of reforms. Here's what they said ought to happen. First, there should be an annual Parliament, an election every year, so that the will of the people was much more nearly represented in fact than was currently the case. Second, members of Parliament should be paid. This was important because, as it stood, only wealthy people with independent incomes could afford to be members of Parliament, and that of course meant that people from the working classes were completely excluded. The Chartists said that there should be no property qualification for members of Parliament, that you didn't have to be a property owner in order to become a member, that there should be universal manhood suffrage. Just by being an adult man, you'd be entitled to vote, that there should be a secret ballot. We've already seen how controversial that was. And that there should be equal-sized constituencies. Although many of the old rotten boroughs had been abolished by the Reform Act, there was still wide variation in the number of people represented in each constituency. Now, by then, by the 1830s and 40s, the United States had many of the things that the Chartists wanted. And the America of the Jacksonian era was a source of inspiration to British radicals at that time, just as it was a kind of horrible vision of what the future might hold for British conservatives. It's perhaps a little bit difficult for us to remember this now, but it was very important throughout the 19th century that the United States looked like the most revolutionary country in the world. And certainly revolutionaries in the old world, in Europe, looked to America as a beacon of hope and inspiration. After the Russian Revolution, of course, the United States was going to become the world's counter-revolutionary leader. But certainly in the days of the British Chartists, they wanted now what the Americans had already got. Robert Peel, the Prime Minister, deplored Chartism as intemperate, an attack on everything he revered. He feared it too, in places where it turned violent. In South Wales, for example, a leader named John Frost led a Chartist uprising. It was brutally suppressed in 1840. There were a series of riots in Lancashire known as the Plug Riots, as disappointed Chartists turned militant. In fact, it's clear now to historians who've studied them that the Chartist movement were weakened by the lack of a central unified leadership, by disagreement about whether or not to undertake violent resistance if their petitions were rejected, and the petitions always were rejected, and by the fact that they lacked an economic programme. After all, to most people in Britain, an economic programme was probably more important than a political one. The vast majority of the British industrial working class, even if they had had the chance to vote once every few years, it wouldn't have made very much difference to them in their lives. Whereas dramatic improvements in their conditions of work and in their pay and their protection as working men would have been much, much more significant. Even so, Chartism terrified the upper classes, particularly the Conservatives, who repeatedly failed to grant the petitions presented to them. And Peel's leadership against the Chartists was widely admired by Conservatives. Peel really came to grief over the Maynooth Grant and the repeal of the Corn Laws, and I'd like now to take them in turn. First of all, the Maynooth Grant from 1845. It was designed to reduce Irish Catholic resentments, but its practical effect was to inflame the opinions of the English Protestants. Recurrently already in the course, I've talked about the way in which Britain found itself unable to adequately mollify Catholic Irish opinion, and this continues right through the 19th and into the 20th century as well. Maynooth was a Catholic seminary. It had been created in 1795 by King George III, so that Catholics who wanted to join the priesthood wouldn't have to go to revolutionary France for their training and ordination. The king was understandably terrified that entering that revolutionary atmosphere, in addition to Catholicism, might be doubly horrible. So the idea was, if the Catholics can train their priests here in Britain, that's safer from a political point of view, and the British government will underwrite it. In 1845, Peel granted it an increased annual revenue and money for repairs to the buildings, in the hope that that would diminish Irish enthusiasm for Home Rule. As I mentioned before, O'Connell had led the movement which eventuated in Catholic emancipation. Now the agitation for Irish Home Rule was beginning. And Peel was hoping to allay some of that enthusiasm by demonstrating a policy of generosity and religious acceptance towards the Catholics. But the Anglicans were horrified. The religious situation in Ireland at the time was this. There was an established church in Ireland as well, the Protestant Church of Ireland. Every Irishman had to pay taxes to support the Irish Protestant Church, even though the vast majority of them didn't attend it and believed that it was heretical. It was central to the Conservative outlook that the church and the state should be bound together, and that to be British was to be Protestant and to be opposed to popery. Hence the great uproar. It looks as though Peel was somehow going over to the Catholics, which in fact he wasn't doing at all. Feelings were so strong about the Maynooth grant that Peel's decision to go ahead with it prompted the resignation from the government of one of its most important junior members, Gladstone, who then joined the opposition and went on later in the century to become a great Liberal Prime Minister. Queen Victoria, on the other hand, was dismayed by the outpouring of bigotry which this incident provoked. And she said, "I'm sure poor Peel ought to be blessed by all the Catholics for the many and noble ways in which he stands forth to protect and do good for poor Ireland. But the bigotry, the wicked and blind passion it brings forth is quite dreadful, and I blush for Protestantism." Well, the repeal of the Corn Laws the next year, 1846, provoked an even greater outcry and led to the fall of Peel's ministry. The Corn Laws had been passed in 1815 and they'd been modified in 1828, and they were laws which quite openly upheld the interest of the landowning classes over against the interests of the urban and working classes. What they did was to place a tariff on imported food, which would have the effect, of course, of making imported food artificially more expensive. That ensured that British landowners would be able to sell food at a higher price and keep rents correspondingly higher. So it helps the farmers to sell food at a high price, but forces the people who have to buy food in the cities to pay more. And it was resented. The Anti-Corn Law League, under the leadership of Richard Cobden and John Bright, represented the interests of the business community and the principle of free trade. Cobden and Bright were both very, very talented organisers, wonderful speakers, both of them from the north of England, the new industrial heartland, and both prosperous manufacturers who were contemptuous of the old aristocratic order. They were eager to sweep away all vestiges of protectionism because they believed that free trade was going to make Britain incomparably more prosperous. They also believed, which was a common belief at the time, that if you have less protectionism and more trade and lower tariff barriers, you're going to promote trading links among the nations of the world, and that itself will have the effect of making conflict less likely. In other words, free trade promotes world peace. Whereas, said Cobden and Bright, aristocrats are the leftovers of an old warrior caste. And so the Corn Laws, I mean, it may sound to us like an aridly technical question, this matter of a tariff. It's very hard to get enthusiastic about the controversy. And it's important for us to recognise that immense symbolic significance hung on these laws. They were more than just a technical bureaucratic detail of government. Certainly, meetings of the Anti-Corn Law League had an evangelical zeal and enthusiasm to them. Cobden and Bright argued that it would end workers' discontent by giving them cheap food, and it would stimulate British industry because British exports would be easier, and that would create more work in British industries, and the nation would be a more prosperous and a happier place. On the other hand, leagues against the Anti-Corn Law League also formed in the English counties, usually under the leadership of Conservative members of Parliament. They didn't think of themselves as defending a material interest, although that's certainly what they were accused of doing by the industrialists, but rather as being upholders of the old order. The historian Bruce Coleman writes, "The Corn Laws now stood not simply as a regulation of practical utility to the landed interest, but also as a symbol of an aristocratic constitution apparently threatened by an alternative system, the thraldom of capital." This is what made Peel's dilemma so difficult. He could certainly see both sides of the question very, very clearly. In fact, Peel understood the benefits of free trade to Britain, the world's industrial leader, and he was already looking for a pretext to abolish the Corn Laws. He was frequently lashed in speeches by Cobden and Bright in Parliament, and yet actually he was in fairly close sympathy with their outlook. He was looking for ways steadily to increase Britain's economic power. And he recognised that British industrial leadership made free trade a favourable prospect. Well, Peel undertook several pieces of legislation in the interests of the business community in the early 1840s. For example, his budget of 1842 removed duties on 700 different imported items, which it says has a freeing effect on trade. The 1844 Bank Charter Act restricted the issue of banknotes to the Bank of England alone, took all sorts of different monies out of circulation, and made sterling more reliable, the banknotes of the Bank of England. He simplified incorporation laws for new businesses, making it easier for new firms to go into operation. What gave Peel the opportunity to repeal the Corn Laws was the outbreak of a terrible famine in Ireland, the great failure of the potato harvest there. Now, this is one of the worst ecological catastrophes in European history. There were no potatoes in Europe until Columbus's discovery of the New World. Potatoes were a New World crop, which were brought back across the Atlantic by the early generations of Atlantic explorers. And they adapted perfectly to Ireland's cool, wet climate, and gradually became the dominant crop there of the Irish peasant people. And Ireland became something like a monoculture, that is, a large environment where only one crop is being grown. Now, the problem with a monoculture is that not only do you set up perfect conditions for the crop itself, you also set up perfect conditions for predators on the crop. And in 1845 and 46, a potato blight infested the Irish potato harvest to make them inedible. And that in turn provoked mass famine because there simply wasn't an alternative available. Ireland suddenly had an immense need for immediate supplies of cheap food. In the vote of February 1846, 112 Conservatives voted with Peel in favour of abolishing the Corn Laws, but 242 other Conservatives voted against, and that had the effect of shattering the party because it was a symbolically very important issue. It was Whig votes with the government, with Peel, which carried the measure, along with stern work for Peel's view on behalf of the Conservatives in the House of Lords by the Duke of Wellington. The historian W.D. Rubenstein says, "It's almost impossible to exaggerate the sense of shock and betrayal felt by many of the protectionist Tories." And he goes on to say, "It demonstrated a woeful political ineptness for a man of his experience and reputation. It was surprising that Peel hadn't done more to conciliate the Conservatives beforehand and find ways to make sure that more of them would vote with his party." The opponents of repeal pointed out that farming was still the biggest employer in the country. Although industry was becoming more and more important, it was still less important than farming, and that the repeal might very well hurt thousands of farm labourers. Besides, critics of repeal said, the Irish aren't in fact going to benefit from the repeal of the Corn Laws. They're too poor to buy food with or without duties. Now, the British response to the famine is itself a vast and complicated issue, much controverted by British and Irish historians right up to the present. Some Irish historians say that it was that Britain's neglect virtually amounted to a kind of genocide. Other historians say, no, in terms of their ability at the time, the British government did what it could, though they all admit that it certainly was inadequate to prevent mass starvation. And it was in the late 1840s that huge numbers of people left Ireland, vast numbers came to Britain, and hundreds of thousands, even millions more, went to Canada and to the United States and to Australia, creating a large part of the Irish population, which has been distinctive in those places ever since. Now, the political result of the repeal of the Corn Laws was the fragmentation of the Conservative Party, which wasn't going to enjoy another parliamentary majority until the election of 1874, which made Benjamin Disraeli the Prime Minister. Meanwhile, in the late 40s and into the 50s, Peel continued to lead a minority Conservative faction. Lord Derby continued to lead a majority Conservative faction, but the two groups could not be reconciled. And again, that opened up a political opportunity to the Whigs as they were being transformed into the modern Liberal Party. Another result of the abolition of the Corn Laws was that British commitment to free trade became stronger than ever. Britain was a free trade nation for the rest of the century, and this coincided with the zenith of Britain's imperial economic power. Free trade was once regarded as an absolutely unquestionable good, although even that now seems to be open to doubt. Now we realise that once Germany and America had caught up industrially by about 1880, free trade was going to become much more of a mixed blessing. because it made it more difficult for Britain to keep out the manufactured goods of its rivals.